Anthony's going to be kicking off architecting a full-stack Jamstack application with FaunaDB, RedwoodJS, and GraphQL. So I am going to pass over control to Anthony now.
Okay. All right, cool. So my name is Anthony Campolo, and I'm going to be talking about architecting full-stack Jamstack applications with FaunaDB, RedwoodJS, and GraphQL. And I wrote an article about this. So here's kind of all the resources. There's a GitHub repo. There's the actual deployed site that I'm going to be showing you. And then the article there, this was done through Fauna's Write with Fauna program. And you can basically apply to submit any sort of article. And after I did that, they said we have a Speak with Fauna program. So I'm here with the Speak with Fauna program. I'm actually not an employee of Fauna. If they wanted to hire me, that'd be great. But as of now, I'm just speaking for them, about them, kind of showing stuff I've built with Fauna. And then if we look over here on the form, this is a really useful resource if anyone wants to see the process that it took to kind of build this. So I went back and forth with another RedwoodJS contributor, David Thryson, and he had done a similar type of project. I think it was with Contentful. And so as I was building out this project, he was kind of helping me out with it. We went back and forth, and if you want to see kind of what it took to get here, that's what it is. And then there's the slides there as well. So let's just talk about first what Redwood is, and then we'll talk about Fauna. Fauna is the database, and Redwood is like our front end framework. So Redwood is a full stack serverless framework for the Jamstack. And what this means is that it's serverless by default. So it's set up in a way where it's going to be deployed to an AWS Lambda. I'm going to be deploying it with Vercel. And it's Jamstack because it's based around the idea of having static files globally distributed across CDNs. And that's been a thing for a while for our like blogs and any sort of like really front end heavy things. But with something like Fauna, now we can do that with our database as well, because Fauna is also a globally distributed kind of serverless database. And we'll talk about that more once we get to the Fauna section. So Redwood is a team of 4 core contributors, Tom Preston Warner, Peter Pistorius, Rob Cameron, and David Price. And a quote that may or may not have been taken out of context: Redwood is the best framework ever created, if not the culmination of nearly 80 years of computer programming methodologies. Rob Cameron, RedwoodJS Core. So this is, you know, a little bit of a joke, obviously, but Redwood is this really cool new type of React-based front-end framework that also has a backend. So this is the architectural diagram, and we're gonna break this down and talk about what kind of each part means. The most important thing is what's on the left. So we have our web folder, which is our front end, and then we have our API folder, which is our backend. So let's look at the front end first. If you've ever used Create React App, then this may look a little bit familiar. It has a public folder and a source folder, and your source folder, it has an, you have an index.html and index.js. So you're gonna have a kind of root component that's going to be loaded into your HTML div like you would with most kind of single page applications. And the main, so you have pages, and as you see here, we have just an H1 tag, and then you can see that at the top, the RedwoodJS plus Fauna, and then our post cell. So this is where our GraphQL query comes in. So if we look at our post cell here, we have on the left, that's our actual query. So we're doing a query for posts, and then we want to get the title of each post. And I'll talk about why that data object is there once we look at our schema definition language. But just intuitively, if you've worked with GraphQL before, this should look very familiar. It's a very basic query. And so our query is named posts, all caps, and then below that is the actual query. And on the right, this is what makes cells kind of unique. So it's a concept introduced by Redwood, and the idea is that we want to have our data fetching be declarative. So what that means is each of the different states that our data could be in, we've declared and exported here. So we have loading, we have empty, we have failure, and we have success. So those should all make sense. Loading is if we're still waiting on the data to arrive from the server. Empty is if we ask for some data and it's just an empty array, we don't have anything in it. And then failure is if there's some sort of error, 400 or 500, and we can get it passed back through that error object. And then the success state is when you actually get the data. So if we look at our success state, we're using object destructuring to pull out the data object from posts. And then we're mapping over the data object to pull out each post title. So in the return statement, we have an unordered list, and inside the unordered list, we're mapping over the data, and then we're creating a list item for each post title. So this is where all of your front end data fetching GraphQL query stuff is happening. Now we're gonna look at the back end. So this is where we get into the stuff that connects into Fauna. So what's really cool about Fauna is it has a GraphQL API. And so if you look at our structure here, that's going to be contained in the db.js. And then we'll go through what each of these different folders is for. So this is our schema definition language. The schema definition language is what allows your front end and your back end to understand each other, to be able to speak the same language. Now, this is the part that was a little tricky in terms of figuring out how to get the two to work together, because what you have to do is you import your schema definition language to FaunaDB. So what you're seeing on the left with type post and type query, that is what you give to Fauna. Now, Fauna, what they do is they take that schema definition language and they kind of add some stuff to it, and you have to figure out what they added to it so that your then front end can also speak that. So once you put it into Fauna, you can look at your actual schema. That's the great thing about GraphQL is you can always see all your types. You can see exactly what you have available to you. So even though Fauna kind of changes and adds some stuff, you can see it all. You just look at what Fauna spit out. And so on the right, this is what's actually in our Redwood project. So what Fauna changed is it added a post page type, and this is for pagination. So this is where that data object came in that we had to pull out with object destructuring and then map over. The data object is containing our array of posts. So you see it has the array with the post type inside of it. So if you're not familiar with schema definition languages, you should go to either howtographql.org or just the actual GraphQL website, and there's a lot of great explanations for how this stuff works. But mostly just what you need to know here is that we're declaring a type and then telling it what that type contains. So we have our post page, which has the data object with post, and then we have our post title, we have our type post, which has our title, and then the title is a string. And then we have our query, which is posts, and then that takes in the post page. So this is how your backend logic kind of works. So the services is where you would centralize your kind of logic. So this ended up kind of being a little wonky how this ended up just because of what we did with Fauna. But the main thing you want to pay attention to is we have the query itself, which is the same that it was in the cells. So this is so your cells and your services are speaking the same language and doing the same query. And then we're awaiting the request and giving it the GraphQL, the Fauna GraphQL API endpoint right there. And then this is the actual query that we're doing to Fauna's GraphQL API. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. So we're importing the GraphQL client. We're using the GraphQL requests library, which is a fairly common kind of request library that you can use to make GraphQL requests. And then we're creating a request variable, and we're doing async function. And inside of that whole function, we're first declaring the endpoint. So that's the graphql.fauna.com/GraphQL. That's the endpoint. And then we're creating our GraphQL client with the new keyword, and then passing in both the endpoint and then also our authorization header. So this is how you are able to authorize yourself and say, I have permission to access this database. And when you create your database, you can create a key, and process.env.faunadb_secret. That is where it's pulling out the key from your environmental variables. So I'll show you that later on when we look at the Vercel deployment. But we have headers, and then inside the headers, you just have authorization and then bearer plus. So all that's doing is just taking bearer and then concatenating on whatever the secret key is that's inside your environmental variable. And then you are doing a try catch just to hit the endpoint. So we do GraphQL client.request and then pass in the query, and then a catch if we get any sort of error. So the query, this whole thing is what's being passed into here where we're doing the request. So in our services, we're importing the request from source lib db, and then we are using it on line 13 to make our query. So that's so services is importing the db here. And then the functions, this is where all of it is sort of brought together in terms of your backend. It brings in your schema, and then it brings in your services, and then it finally brings in your database, and it combines all of that into a single GraphQL handler that is then deployed on AWS Lambda. And we're currently working on Azure and Google, so this will be able to be deployed pretty much anywhere. And this is what's really fascinating about Redwood, is that it's serverless by default. So this comes out when you just when you create your Redwood app. So I didn't write any of this code. You don't have to change any of this code. This was kind of just the default that's already there. And then you select what database you want, you decide what kind of queries you want, and then you tell it what your schema definition language is. So you write all this stuff, and then this is kind of the magic that pulls it all together and then makes it easy to deploy with just like a one-click kind of deploy. So that's Redwood. That's the Redwood half. Now we're going to talk about Fauna. So Fauna is a global serverless database for ubiquitous low latency access to app data. And then here's the team that is behind Fauna. You have Eric Berg, CEO, Evan Weaver, CTO, Matt Friels, Chief Architect, and Dhruv Gupta, CMO. And Evan was one of the original developers who was scaling Twitter, and a lot of what he's built with Fauna is very influenced by the scaling issues he saw with Twitter, and the idea being that he wanted to create something that could be easily used by any sort of company who's scaling up. And that's why Fauna is such a natural fit for Redwood, because they're both based around this kind of serverless, scalable by default model. So what we're going to be looking at here is going to be FQL. So FQL is what's called the Fauna query language. It's a little bit like a Lisp. If you've ever used something like Scheme or Clojure, those are Lisps, and it's like just functions inside of functions inside of functions inside of functions. So it's lots of parentheses and kind of chained functions. So it can be a little strange the first time you see it if you've never kind of worked with a language like that before. But once you kind of get the feel for it, actually, I really like Lisp, so I think it's super cool. But I know this is a really big pain point for a lot of people who come to Fauna, so it's worth mentioning. So at the top, we're doing the create collection and giving it a name and the name is post. So we're creating a collection called post. So if you've ever used something like MongoDB or other document-like databases, Fauna is similar in that you create collections, and then inside the collections you have basically they're kind of like objects that are like key value pairs. And you can also put indexes on it for retrieval and search and things like that. So at the top we see the command, and at the bottom that's what you get back. And this is what you would see if you were using the Fauna shell. You can use the Fauna shell from your terminal, or you can go to their website. They have a really great dashboard that makes it really easy to do all the stuff, even if you're not that smooth with the terminal. So it gives you a ref. That ref is collection with posts inside, and then it gives you a timestamp, days, and then the name. So after you create a collection, you can put documents in there. So we're creating a kind of just like a blog post with just a title. So when I was building this, I wanted to make it as simple as possible because just connecting the two of them was going to be fairly complicated. So this is really just a kind of proof of concept to show how to stitch the two together. So I just wanted to just create a list of titles and then render those titles on the screen. So we're creating a title here, and then at the bottom you can see it gives you all the information for that title. Then here, this is just kind of giving you a couple more examples of what you can do with FQL. This shows you how you can create multiple documents at once. So we're using the map command, and then we're using lambda, and then create collection. So if you've ever done like a map function in other languages, it's the same idea. So we're mapping the post title to each of them. So we give them the post titles, and then you want to map a post title onto each post. And then on the right, you see it gives you both of those two titles that we created. And then here we're creating our index. So the index is what's going to allow us to query our posts. So we're just creating an index called posts. So that matches up with our schema definition language that we did before. So the posts contained just the title. And then you see on the bottom, we get the index, and it gives you the source, so you know what collection the index goes with. Cool, so those are all the slides. So now let's take a look. All right, so this is the GitHub. So if you actually want to see the code that's all in a project here, this is where you'd want to go. My GitHub is AJC Web Dev. And if we go to the API, we go to source, and then we go to lib and database. So this was the slide I showed you where we had our Fauna secret key in the process. And so that is being used here on Vercel. So now this is where it is deployed. So if we go to settings, this was the kind of one-click deploy that we have now with RedwoodJS. So you have different framework presets that, things like Jekyll, Nuxt, Sapper, all those kind of like things that do static site generation or other things. We now have a RedwoodJS one. So it gives you the exact build command you need and development command, and it does everything for you. And then here, if we look at our environmental variables, this is our FaunaDB secret. So we got this from FaunaDB.com and then put it in here, and then you can see the value is encrypted. So this is the Fauna dashboard, and here is the Redwood Fauna project. So as we saw before, we have our collections, which has a post collection, and then our indexes with posts. So if we look at collection, you see the documents, and if we look at indexes, you see the documents as well. And this is the actual site as it's deployed. So anyone can go to this URL right here and they will see this. And just to kind of prove that this is all connected and working, we're going to go in here and we're going to create a new document. So the document is an object with a key and value. So the key is going to be title. And then we're going to say, don't mess with Texas. $2,000 fine for. And then we are going to save that. And then here, refresh. And there it is. So as you saw, it was loading for a second, and then it came once we had the data. Now let's take a look here in our developer tools. So this is what we got, just as we were showing. It has the UL, and then each of these are list items. And then if we go to network here, we can see GraphQL request is happening here, and it's status 200, type fetch. And if we open that up, we go to the bottom. This was the query we defined in our cell. It has posts in all caps, and it's doing the posts query, which is pulling posts data title, and then type name post. And then if we look at the actual preview, here is the data object we're getting, which contains posts, and then big data object with the actual posts. And then each of them have a type name. So the type name is post for each of these. And then this big data object, the type name is post page. And yeah, that's the presentation. So does anyone have any questions about that?